The hip hinge is one of my favorite hip dominant movements, and one of those things I often teach as a starting point before we start adding more complexities in resistance to the movement. So just to give you an example of the hip hinge, all it is small bend in the knees and strictly hip movement. So you can see my knees are staying the same. I'm hinging through my hips as my butt sinks back, again, that hip flexion, and then I'm going to extend through the hips to stand up. Why I like that movement is to help differentiate between hip and lumbar motion. So if you can see, a common tendency for that is for people just to stand up, to arch the back and use some of those muscles around the spine to stand up, something like this. So a lot of people I see with low back pain or just don't know the movement will feel like, oh yeah, that's great, that's a good low back exercise. When in reality, if you're driving through the hips, you should feel little tension around the lower back unless you're adding a lot of resistance to the movement. So just teaching yourself to move around the hip without knees or low back changing its position is very important. But when you do that with body weight, it's often hard to appreciate which muscles are firing because there's not really any resistance in any direction. So when that's the case and it's hard to really grasp, the movement actually looks pretty good. It looks like a proper hip hinge, but you might still think to yourself, I'm not really sure what's happening. I know I'm doing the movement, I can appreciate the movement, but I don't know which muscles are firing. I don't really feel the glutes firing like they should. What I like to do in that case is to actually set up a band around hip height or just under hip height. What I'm actually going to do is step inside the band because we want to work on with this movement, instead of teaching the body to stand up and that back to extend to get yourself upright, teach the hips how to drive forward, because if we can teach the hips, see from this position, if we have some resistance, so this is actually pulling me around where I want to create the movement, so it provides a little feedback in that sense, but it also teaches you which way to drive, which if I drive from this position, if I drive my hips forward, automatically my body stands up, but I'm doing it in a way that's using the hips and not the back. So just to show you a couple reps, small bend in the knees, band is pulling the hips back. I'm going to drive against the band, engaging the glutes to stand myself up, and then I'm going to go through repetitions like that. So using some other stimulus here to help weight the hips is a great starting point, because when you get to the more traditional hip hinge movements, when you start adding weight and doing a barbell or a dumbbell or the single leg version, this will teach you how to drive the hips forward, get better glute engagement, and help lead to a better hip hinge movement pattern that is actually using the right muscles as opposed to getting more lower back, hamstring, some other areas involved.